Hello, I am Enrique Quezada, and this is the Judy Lay Allen Mexico Centered podcast from the Center for the United States and Mexico at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. After almost 5 years and 71 episodes, this is my last episode as your host. It has been a rewarding experience, and I hope that you have found this podcast to be both informative and entertaining. As you will hear in the conversation for today, I went to see Tony Payan, the director of the Center for the United States and Mexico. I went in thinking we would do a wrap-up of the López Obrador administration up to this point and look forward toward the future. And we did do some of that, but Tony decided to turn the tables and ask me some questions about my experience as a host. I was a bit unprepared for this, as I'm usually on the interviewer side, not the interviewee side, but it was fun to look back at some of the episodes we've done and talk about how this podcast has contributed to the work of the center. Mexico Centered will continue with a new host, so stay tuned for that. Without further ado, here's my conversation with Tony Payan. Tony Payan, Director of the Center for the United States and Mexico. Thank you for being on the podcast again.
My pleasure. It's good to be here, Enrique.
And I got to say, we haven't hinted at this, but this is our last episode, or my last episode as a host. And so I wanted to sit down with you and talk about kind of a wrap-up of what we're seeing right now in Mexican politics with the López Obrador administration, what we expect in this last few years, and with a view towards 2024. That I know you as the director of the center are starting to look at those issues, right? So
sure. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I guess you're right. This is the 71st episode.
Yes.
So it's been quite a few. It's been you've been doing this for like 5 years or so.
Right.
But for those who listen to us, Enrique Quezada is a graduate student at Rice University, and Enrique has been a PhD student for those years. From the very beginning, he came over to the Center for the U.S. and Mexico and took over the podcast. I mean, you've been working on this really since your first year.
Yes.
At Rice. So it's been it's really been a long road. You're on your final year, and soon you'll be in the job market. So it's time for you to move on. We certainly hope to continue our podcast. We're going to retool. We're going to take a hiatus and retool for early next year. So we'll come back with episode number 72. Then there'll be a different host. But I'm certainly very grateful to you, Enrique, for having done these 71 episodes. It's a long road. It's been a few years. And the podcast has really been an important feature of our work here at the Mexico Center. And so let me ask you a question. Over those 5 years, you've interviewed a good number of guests. I guess I've been a guest in probably 4 or 5 of those episodes, maybe 6. But, we've had over 50 different guests, or 55, who knows how many. So tell me a little bit about your guests. How did you experience different guests, the knowledge they produce, the conversations, and how these things have evolved. So let me turn the tables on you and sort of ask you, what you learned and what you thought was interesting about doing this podcast for the Center for the U.S. and Mexico.
Yeah, well, I'll think a bit on my feet because I was not coming here. I was not expecting this.
It's all right,
but
conversation.
But I appreciate it.
We're not Terry Gross, and we're not the Daily of the New Yorker Daily or anything like that. But we're a podcast focused on Mexico, and if anyone knows what's been in the podcast, it's you. You've been the host for all those episodes.
Yeah. So, I mean, the podcast started as focusing on the elections of 2018. So it's been a while. And, the focus back then was just on the elections and maybe different issues around the elections that were going to be important. So I really enjoyed talking about that. When I came to Rice, I was very much interested in elections in Mexico, and so this was great for me to come in and work with the center, and interviewed some of the guests that came here to talk, and I remember having great experiences. Now there's some episodes that kind of are some highlights for me, even the perhaps like the office of the guest, what they did. I can think of Santiago Nieto, for example, a very important figure in terms of fighting corruption with the Lopez Obrador administration. So,
a kind of an odd figure because he was the financial intelligence guy in Mexico, and then now he's being accused of corruption at the same time. So you've seen some of these interesting historical developments themselves.
Yes,
Santiago Nieto and some political figures, some governors.
Garcia de Vaca, the former governor of Tamaulipas, who also sat here and we talked. So I mean some of those names, and then there's also like other episodes, some recent ones, for example, with Bob Kramenacher and Javier Ochoa, who take care of the areas around the Rio Grande, and more kind of like an ecological perspective on just kind of the work and the cooperation that happens across the border that is not political.
Right.
So that was an interesting one. Along the same lines was one episode with Scott Egan, who is an evolutionary biologist here at Rice, just talking about how the border, kind of these physical barriers affect the gene pool.
Yeah, the evolution of the species that are essentially split into groups by the wall. Yeah, that was an interesting podcast. So I remember that.
Yeah, so that was that was very interesting for me. Talking to Jacqueline Pichard, who was used to be the head of the National Anti-Corruption System, and so that was a big topic. Kind of when it was established, and did it work? Did it not? Did it have any teeth to really do the work that it was tasked to do? And that was a very fascinating conversation for me because it was a topic that I really cared about and was following, and it was interesting to know, those who were working in this and what they thought about that.
Right. So in some ways, I think what you've done is you've witnessed along these conversations and in the content of these conversations a lot of what has happened in Mexican history in the last 4, almost 5 years, because you've interviewed people dealing with corruption, people dealing with the economy and trade and elections and politics and water, binational issues and things like that. So at the end of the day, I think you've had a good knowledge just by conversation, 20 minutes at a time, because that's what the podcast lasts on average, 20, 22 minutes. You've had these in-depth conversations live on what's going on in Mexico, what's going on the ground. So what do you think is the utility of a podcast? And I ask this question because I am a podcast listener, and not just this podcast, but also the New York Daily and Freakonomics and many other very interesting podcasts that I listen to. And obviously it seems to me that they were very much in vogue during the pandemic. And then now podcasts are not as, I guess, as attractive or as interesting. But nonetheless, they kind of leave behind a kind of a good record of what was going on at the time, issues that were being discussed, people that are thinking about the issues. So do you think that podcasts have a future? Do you think podcasts are interesting? And what do you think about this podcast in the future? What are your recommendations about, where we should go from here, especially now that we're retaking our lives in person and that perhaps we have less time to listen to podcasts?
Yeah, that's a good point. I've been listening to podcasts for a while myself, like way before the pandemic. So I would say they're growing, and if there was some, I guess if more people came to podcasts during the pandemic, I think overall we're probably going to continue to see some increase in this industry. I think of the role of this podcast, particularly when I was thinking about what we can offer as a podcast. I think there's a couple of things where it's like, well, we want to make the information digestible, right? And so I think when I was preparing for interviews, I always thought of like, what's the narrative here? Like, yes, we have a lot of information, but if I think it's much easier if we have a story that we can tell. And in this case, it's not a story that I tell, but a story that I help my guest tell, right? So there's always what questions would I ask, right? If I wanted to know where this starts, or what piece of information do I need so that I can actually understand what's going to happen or the topic we're discussing. And then questions that I thought build on that. So if I did my job correctly, I hope that listeners, found the content digestible and interesting and informative. And I think part of the reason I listen to podcasts is because there's something about this format that I really enjoy, and also that I it's like I like the information, but it's also kind of interesting and entertaining. If I'm just walking or I'm driving, I can put it in the car or washing dishes or those things.
I mean, it's not quite a script, but at the same time, you did some research. If you knew that the guest was somebody who was dealing with elections in Mexico or the anti-corruption system or perhaps a governor or the security or women in Mexico or climate change and the border or the wall or something like that, you did read and you did kind of craft some questions. You prepared, and then you read some, and then you sort of thought through the questions so that when the guest sat with you at the table, then you had some idea of what you wanted to ask and how it was all going to come together, right? I mean, people sometimes don't realize that there's some research behind this.
Yeah. Yes. So it was always I had to read, and sometimes it was stuff that I was not familiar with at all, right? I remember talking to a couple of anthropologists, and as a political scientist, the writing is different, and so. It was interesting to read some of this different genres or maybe a topic that I didn't know much. And it's like, well, I need to know enough so that I can craft these questions that can tell this story, as I was saying, because otherwise, I don't want to come to the table and yes, I can ask questions, but I want to ask informed questions that can also grab more of the details of the important, stuff that, people who might know a little bit about this topics, would be wondering.
And also, the other thing that I think it's interesting is that some of the podcasts were obviously guests, like former governor, now or about to be former governor of Tamaulipas, Mr. Garcia Cabeza de Vaca. And then, of course, we invite him to a table and sort of do a recording with him, and we have a conversation on his state, what's happening in his state, what he thinks, and all that stuff, right? Or, an expert on corruption and things like that. But others are based on our research at the center. So there's a white paper, an issue brief, a project going on, and then some of us are invited to talk about what the project was about. Yeah. You mentioned, for example, Scott Egan's paper on the wall and the effect that dividing a species on two sides of a wall will have on the gene pool and the eventual differentiated evolution of the same species into two groups, completely different over time because they've been separated and they can't really reproduce together. Yeah. And so I think he gave an interesting example of a fly that came from England in the ships, and then that fly, once it was introduced in North America, it took off in a different direction, and now it's a species of the fly. The same fly that was in England that came here, but that they evolved differently because one was in England in that environment, adjusting and adapting to that environment, and then here the fly had to take off in a different direction, eating different things, adjusting to a new climate, etc. So that matters, and so that was part of the research that we published. And so sometimes you had to read the paper and then begin to kind of ask questions based on that, right?
Yeah. So and it's one. A lot of the times, I mean, I find myself seeing a lot of papers that are published and things like that, and you don't have the time to necessarily go and look at that. So I always appreciate when podcast, there's a topic that I'm interested in, and someone has distilled some of that and ask questions that can really give you the information that you need and make you think about the topic. So I had to do some of that same work of reading those papers and figuring out what's the best way to help communicate the work that other people do here at the center, and help them bring it to a broader audience in a different format.
Now, obviously, this is a Mexico-centered podcast, and that's a name that you came up with. That was your suggestion because you used to have a podcast. What was it called? Independientemente or something like that? Or I don't know if it's still on, but you
can find the episodes. I haven't done any more work on that.
Okay, but that was a personal podcast, and so you already came with the skills and all that. And so all we did is take your skills and your knowledge and your eagerness as a graduate student and your interest in Mexico and your ability to speak two languages, and we really just brought them to the table. So you brought a set of unique skills that not everybody finds. I mean, sometimes you have knowledge of the subject, you have knowledge of the country, you have knowledge of the binational relationship, you have research skills, and you also have the technical skills to do the work that it takes to slice and splice the file after you're done recording. But what do you think about the utility of a podcast on Mexico, and why do you think it was so important to do that? Now, in hindsight, obviously, it's easy to ask the question, but at that time, we just plunged into it. We just went into it. But over time, what do you think about the utility of a podcast focused on the binational relationship and issues that are going on in Mexico? Because this is a uniquely focused podcast. There's many different podcasts on many different subjects, but this one was focused on what's going on in Mexico and the impact of that and the lives of many of us who cross the border so often.
Yeah. So I think that one thing, I remember, I think back then I was listening to this podcast called The President's Inbox, I think, and it was from the Council of Foreign Relations. And, they talked about all kinds of relationships between the U.S. and a different country. And so I guess this was a good, there's so much happening in the relationship between Mexico and the United States, right? But I think kind of when we are talking kind of in general, national topics, this relationship doesn't really come up that often, maybe except for issues of immigration. But other than that, I think it's not very clear what that relationship is and how does life at the border look like, what kind of cooperation actually is happening there on the ground. You're right, we only see the national headlines. And so to me, having a podcast that focuses on that and features some of people who are writing on those topics, and I'm learning also about the relationship and what happens in other states. And, there is cross-border collaboration that I think maybe and in other places you don't really hear about that often. Right. And just recently, again, we had the episode on the collaboration that happens across the Rio Grande in terms of conservation efforts. Right. And that's something that I never heard of before, and, very, very interesting.
These are kind of the upside notes, the nice things that you find out that in the Big Bend National Park between Texas and Coahuila, there are some people that are actually dedicated to preserving the canyons, the river, the flora, the fauna, the environment and things like that. And it's nice to see these kind of collaborations because they often fly under the radar. Yeah. And so we try to feature not just the bad things. Obviously, there's a lot of corruption in Mexico. There's insecurity. There's mass migration, and talk about those kind of complicated issues that you mentioned, but also kind of highlight some of the really interesting collaboration, the enormous economic activity that goes on between the two countries, like NAFTA, and to get them to know them. And I think as a director of the center, I think you have to reach different audiences, and different audiences may be reached by different means. And so research is one thing. Our publications, we got 260 publications, from books to articles, journal articles, to white papers, to issue and policy briefs, to blog posts and to op-eds. So we got a number of publications here. Over the 9 years of the center, I think it's a very good collection. It's a good library of knowledge about Mexico by now. And then, of course, we have our outreach to the media. We provide expertise. We have events. You've interviewed a lot of the event participants. And the podcast was another way of reaching a different audience. Maybe, like you said, somebody walking who was heard something and found you online. And maybe over time, they kind of begin to learn about the importance of the binational relationship. Yeah. To me, this was a good additional means of reaching people who may be ignorant of the kind of real breadth and depth of the binational relationship. Yes. And, I got to say that, I don't know about you, but I wasn't sure how the podcast was going to go when we started. And, it was really rewarding to see, that it was growing and that we were getting more and more listeners. And so, that's something that, that I appreciated. And also, talking to Lisa Wakata, our program manager that I mentioned in every episode, and with you about, that I heard you appreciate the work that the podcast was that was being done in the podcast. And so that was rewarding for me to say, okay, this is helping,
kind of bring these topics to the public in a different way, kind of complementing the other work that you were doing?
I mean, you never know, right? I mean, over 70 episodes, this will be the 71st. Tens of thousands of downloads overall. I mean, that's pretty substantive. That means there's a lot of interest out there, and not everybody can be reached by the same means. So we have to find different ways of doing it. And this is a kind of a conversational way of reaching people and providing information and talking about the center and what we do. And so I think this was a brilliant idea, and not always planned. Like when you came to the center to work for us as a graduate fellow, we just knew at some point that you had this skill, and so we just saw opportunity, and so that's how it was born, regardless of how it evolved. And you're right, more and more successful every time. That's how it was born.
Yeah, I remember coming here to your office, and I wanted to get involved and kind of thinking about what we might do around the elections, because the center had a project at the time, very extensive project to put out information and understand, kind of analysis of the electoral cycle. And, I had that experience of podcasting already, kind of a couple of podcasts that I had started and kind of a personal projects. And I learned a lot from those. I made lots of mistakes in those in terms of kind of how to produce a podcast that sounds good. And so I already had a lot of that experience under my belt. And so I think we were able to kind of get started on this one kind of a little bit faster. I had equipment. I had the expertise of how to set it up, mistakes I had made that I was like, I don't want to make them again. And so, it also works so well, I think, with that topic at the time of the elections, of just, having people from different perspectives who came to some of the events here, and so we're able to talk with them, and so to take some of those events that the center had here, but also then give them to another audience, right? And
I think you might have interviewed one of the biggest defenders of the López Obrador administration, maybe Ackerman, perhaps.
Yes,
John Ackerman, who was, he's an American who lives in Mexico and obviously a big defender of López Obrador. I've been a critic of the López Obrador administration. I feel revindicated over time. After 4 years, I think it's a disaster, and I've said it, and I will continue to say it. But you've had both perspectives. You've had people who argue for, and you've had people who argue against.
And people who are kind of in the middle, who I think expected to see the López Obrador administration going in a different direction than it ended up going in. So we definitely had these different perspectives.
Now, I think sometimes producing a podcast, and I'm certainly very grateful for the kind of complete set of skills that you brought, but sometimes you don't realize that there's also some technical board behind it. Then you have to go and you have to review the content, sometimes slice and splice if there's something wrong with the recording, and then of course you have to add the music and the introduction and so it was quite a bit of work. It was like hours a week. So often the listener, because like I said, I'm a podcast listener. When I exercise, I sometimes listen to podcasts. So clearly, all you're hearing is the final product. There's a lot of work behind it, and not just the kind of intellectual work that we, preparing the questions, reading, and getting ready for the interview, but also, the post-interview work, which is all that technical, and then finally putting it on the internet for people to listen to. And so there's quite a bit of it. And I think for a center like ours at the Baker Institute at Rice University to take on this, to try to reach a different audience, I think it's taking quite a bit of effort. And I think you've done a really good job at projecting us to a different audience, perhaps.
Well, I appreciate that. And yes, it does take quite a bit of work. And it also depends on... sometimes I make a lot of mistakes. Sometimes a guest might not be in their best day, and so sometimes it takes some time to get the interview ready. Have to write my script, but I also think if you listen to other podcasts, when you listen to them, that someone had to sit through a lot of audio to make sure what was the best cut.
And the most interesting thing is that here there is it's a one-man shop. I mean, you have the equipment, you know how to handle the equipment. We set you up the interviewer, but then you do the interview, you do the technical board, you set it up, and you publish it. And so it's there it is. I mean, it's like it's not like a studio. It's literally mounting a couple of microphones here on the table in office and recording it, and then doing the work in the computer, and there it goes. So it doesn't look like it takes a lot because when you look at this equipment, it's a simple equipment, but it's a lot of work. It's probably a few hours a week doing this.
Yeah, so shout out to Lisa Wakata, who took care of like finding the guest and kind of helping me as we were working around my schedule to figure out a time to do this interviews. And so and also quality control. She had to listen to the episodes before they came out. Yes,
but I think it's a podcast interesting to me because it focuses on what is one of the most important relationships for the United States. I mean, people often don't think about Mexico, and obviously, we just saw the book by Jared Kushner. He talks about Mexico, and he talks about how he made the López Obrador administration fold on issues of immigration and trade and the threats that the Trump administration made against Mexico. And then, of course, we saw Barack Obama's biography, and he doesn't really mention Mexico. Hardly at all, if at all. I don't really remember, but I haven't seen the whole volume yet. But and so Mexico is often an afterthought for Americans, but I think there's hardly any country that has such a deep impact on the lives of so many millions of Americans as Mexico does. Mm-hmm. Not Israel, not China, not Russia, not any country in Europe. It's Mexico because it's 2,000 miles of border. It's drug trafficking. It's migrant smuggling. Human trafficking. It's deep cultural, historical, and linguistic integration. We see it in Texas, we see it in California, we see it in Arizona, certainly in New Mexico. There is a lot of traffic across the border, 280 vehicles cross the border every year, hundreds of thousands of people every single day that cross the border. Millions of tourists from the United States go to Mexico, 1.6 million Americans living in Mexico, 40 million Americans having Mexican ancestry, whether undocumented or documented or third, second, third, fourth generation. So these, it's a long relationship. Right. It's an intense relationship, let alone the investment relationship and, of course, the trade relationship, which is second only to Canada. And obviously Canada, China, and Mexico sort of interchange the first place, but they're always second, first, and third. And so, and I think only expected to get more intense. So we're really dealing with one of the most important relationships for the United States with a direct impact on so many millions of Americans. And I wonder why Mexico continues to be an afterthought for so many Americans. Like you said, once you move, 200-300 miles from the border, it's really just an afterthought. People probably know more about Canada than they do about Mexico, and yet Mexico has a deeper impact. So I'm not sure what to attribute that to. I mean, it's the most transited border in the world, right? I mean, you come from the border out there in California, Baja California. I come from the border between El Paso and Juarez, and there's all kinds of interaction and families living on both sides, bilingual and so on. And here we are, still having to prove the importance of studying this relationship. And I think this podcast probably went a long way to sort of break down to a more granular level the dynamics of the relationship and why watching Mexico and understanding what happens in Mexico has a kind of a ripple effect into the United States. I mean, what happens imagine if Mexico goes into chaos, and it seems to me that right now governance is compromised, that the economic situation is deteriorating, and what are we looking at? More Mexicans trying to cross the border without documents or asking for asylum, which they don't qualify for. So whatever happens there, it's going to eventually ripple right into the border and even across the border. So I think Americans ought to be paying a lot more attention to what happens in Mexico, and I think that's our mission as a center. And I think this podcast was a way of having bit by bit, like that drop on the rock slowly, making
Right.
sure that you make a difference and create conscious awareness of what the importance of Mexico is for the U.S.
Yeah. Well, I'm happy that I contributed in some way to the work of the center. It has been 5 years, so it has been quite a bit of thinking back and thinking, well, this is the 71st episode. It's been a lot of work. As the podcast moves forward, later on, I'm excited to see, what the next season of the podcast looks like.
So I thank you for doing this exercise for the center. I think it's an important one. I think we're going to take a hiatus so that we reorganize and find another host as brilliant as you and as skillful as you. And then, it'll take us 2, 3, 4 months to get our act together. And hopefully by January we'll relaunch it and then continue this conversation. It'll be a different host, but I think it's probably a conversation that should continue because there are people who are tuned to podcasts, and I think it might be a different audience than those who read our papers or come to our events or call me for opinion and analysis. And so this is the way we this is part of our outreach and our work, and I hope that in 3 or 4 months we will have a relaunching of this important podcast. So thank you for these years of work and all that you've done for the center, and hopefully we'll see you soon. And I hope that your dissertation will be done soon, and you're somewhere
Don't
working.
do this to me.
You're somewhere working as Dr. Enrique Quezada.
Well, I appreciate the good wishes, and I guess that's kind of like you telling me I need to get back to work.
Yes.
Only my advisor gets to do that, Tony.
That's right. Well, I guess you got one more advisor now. So.
Well, Tony Payan, Director of the Center for the United States and Mexico, thank you for sitting with me and for these questions that you asked me. Get to reverse the roles today. And just, thank you for allowing me to work with the center and do this. And I'm happy to see this being part of what the center puts out.
Well, thank you, Enrique. We'll see you in the cafeteria, in the hallway, or down in the yard of the university every now and then. Thank you.
Thank you. That was Tony Payan and me. That is it for this episode. Thank you for listening to the Judy Lee Allen Mexico Center podcast. Thanks to Elsa Huaqueta, our program manager, and to Tony Payan, the director of the Center for the United States and Mexico at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. Special thanks to Judy Lee Allen for her generous support of the work we do at the center. You can visit our website at bakerinstitute.org/Mexico, where you can find our latest publications. Views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the guests and the host and do not necessarily reflect those of the center. If you have any comments or suggestions, you can email us at usmexicocenter@rice.edu. We would love to hear from you. Mexico Centered is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, Radio Public, and Spotify. You can subscribe through your favorite podcast app to receive all of our new episodes directly on your phone. I am Enrique Quezada. It's been a pleasure being your host.